government and you're planning to do a public event, you've got to tell the press office beforehand and get permission to come out and speak to you, speak with you. I called a press officer a few days ago just to clear this formally, and he said, not a very philosophical soul, he said, so what's the event? And I said, it's on E.F. Schumacher. And there was a pause on the phone, and the press officer says, wait, hang on, you mean the creative destruction guy? That sounds a bit risky. And I said, no, E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. And he said, well, okay, that sounds pretty good. So at least in the mind of one press officer, Small is very much still beautiful. It's really wonderful to be here and see so many people here, and really over the past year, see so much written about and talked about Schumacher's work, and thinking about why his legacy is so enduring, why his work has proved to be so resilient. I think two things in particular come to mind. The first, as Andrew said, is this understanding, appreciation of the kind of inherent limitations of human knowledge, the sort of epistemological sort of, fallacy of assuming that you can know everything, and that deep skepticism of large-scale utopian projects, I think, to all of us perhaps seems as relevant today as ever before. And the second thing related to that, again, has been touched on already, this issue of the fragilizing sort of consequences of scale, size, not only the too big to fail, the systemic consequences of size when something big falls over, but also the internal riskiness that comes with size, that kind of hidden threat posed by complexity.
Well, so there's a whole range of small-scale things there. I think there is a paradox in I think, forgive me, in something you said, which is, where are the resources to build a big society? And I think one of the things that is interesting is that 18 months ago, over 50% of all the money received by charities in the UK came from the state. And that, I think, following Schumacher, isn't a particularly resilient model. It's not a particularly empowering model. And so we've done a lot in terms of philanthropy tax breaks, funding for endowments, for cultural institutions, and so on, to try and foster that kind of resilient, bottom-up approach to funding for community institutions rather than the big, heavy hand and lumpy government funding. In a sense, austerity could be described as an attempt or a requirement to try and do more for less. And I think if that's applied to environmental resources, that's not a bad thing. And so that type of sort of thriftiness with regards to environmental resources, I think is very much in the line of Schumacher's thought. I think where efficiency does get difficult is when businesses are hollowed out, when services are hollowed out in the name of efficiency, but that efficiency is fragilizing. Why? Because it removes the buffer of redundancy, the scope for error. Most of us are born with 2 kidneys, which is not a particularly efficient strategy that nature has chosen, but it is one that provides redundancy, scope for error. And I think that's something that's been lost in the kind of conception of efficiency that we have. We don't properly capture the extent of risk that we face. The same is true when government, I think, and businesses too, think about value for money. The range of indicators, the range of sort of inputs and outputs that are considered are really very narrow, and so much of kind of austerity thinking winds up being very denuded, very hollowed out. One of the things we're doing that I think is quietly perhaps one of the most subversive things we're trying to do in government is to rewrite a book called the Green Book, and the Green Book is a bit of a misnomer. It's nothing at all environmental. It is the methodology by which the Treasury evaluates value for money. And so it's a big dense document, and any big piece of government spending or infrastructure has to pass through the gauntlet of the Green Book. And what's fascinating about it is that it places very little emphasis on environmental impact, very little emphasis, no emphasis really on the impact on social capital, on social interaction, nothing on well-being. And we are rewriting that to incorporate, essentially small is beautiful type indicators. And I think changing that conception of value for money will be, if we can pull it off, a very radical act. The final thing that I'd just like to say on austerity is that there is a beautiful concept in Schumacher's work, as I'm sure you're aware of enoughness. And I think that is perhaps the most radical idea in that work. And this sort of question which John Gray also addresses, the philosopher John Gray also addresses, of sort of the psychological impact of a zero growth world, or a zero growth economy. How do you sort of conceptualize that? What is your sense of progress if GDP isn't increasing? I think that's a very deep question, actually, and that's not to sort of sidestep GDP, but I think that it is something that is hugely relevant to what's going on in Britain today, what's going on in Western Europe today, what potentially is happening in America today too. And of all of Schumacher's ideas, I think that's one that's perhaps most worth debating in 2012. Something that we say constantly, and I think the Prime Minister said a bunch of times as well, is that if the breaking up of monolithic, centralised public services winds up with circularisation, winds up with Serco, with Capita winning the majority of contracts, or even just a big chunk of the contracts, we failed. Right? We're very open about that as a kind of test for our reform agenda, for our sort of big society agenda, as it were. And it's quite a tough test because big government is very comfortable talking to and dealing with big business. As I say, 70% of government IT contracts, when we were elected, were going to just 7 companies like Serco and like Capita. So what are we doing about it? Where will the hope come from? Well, a bunch of things. Lots of them very techy. The opening up of procurement and removing the barriers to smaller companies is really arcane. It's something we just spend a fiendish amount of time on. It used to be the case, again, when we were elected, just 18 months ago, that you had to provide 3 years worth of audited accounts to bid for a government contract. So if you were a startup, if you were a new company, you were literally locked out at the get-go. I mean, not to mention the other kind of complexities within the system. So much of that has changed. And to give you a statistic, again, when we were elected, 7% of government contracts went to small companies. The rest, Serco, Capita, etc. We're now up to 16%. Now that's still nothing, really, in the overall scheme of things, given that the majority of companies, the vast majority of companies, are small companies. But we are inching forward, step by step, climbing mountain probable.